speaker, or you can hit the grid view, and that shows, for me, I can see about 9 people in the grid view. So you have those 2 options of view. So I'd like to start off talking about what might have been some major discoveries, some fun things that you found in the text, anything maybe that you had not seen or realized before, or anything new that popped out in your reading this past week. If you would like to contribute, you can just raise your hand and I will see that you want to speak. Yes, Nick, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, it's Cynthia. So one of the things, So one of the things that we toyed with over this week was why Hamlet's uncle was on the throne rather than Hamlet, since he was the son of the king. So we did a little bit of research. No, a very little bit of research, and we only found one source, but we were reading that at that time that it didn't necessarily fall to the son, and I'm not sure I fully understand that. So if you can expand upon that, of how the uncle legally took the throne, that might help us all a little bit with understanding the rest of the action.
Sure. Well, you know, the interesting thing about Danish rule, especially during this time period, is it may not have exactly mirrored what we understand to be how leaders kind of get to the throne nowadays. So, you know, if you look at Elizabethan England and even the history of England, usually when the king dies, the first male heir is in line for the throne. And then that's changed over the years. Sometimes if there was not a male heir, it might go to a male cousin that was still in, you know, a direct bloodline. But then we've seen how that's even changed, and the first female heir, if the only heirs are female, have ascended to the throne. The current Queen of England, Elizabeth II, as well as Elizabeth I, ascended to the throne because male heirs were not available. Those rules were not necessarily the same in some other countries. So Scotland, Denmark, Wales, they kind of had a different system of how people might ascend to the throne. And because Claudius married Queen Gertrude, that kind of brought his legitimacy to the throne. Ideally, when the King Hamlet died, Gertrude would have kind of taken leadership of the land. And then when Claudius married Gertrude, that kind of would have made him the successor to the throne. So that's kind of how the Danish rule worked, which may be a little unfamiliar to us if we're thinking of Elizabethan ascension to the throne. Emily Hansen has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm wondering if it's similar, you know, going to the question is asked, if it's similar to what was called Tanist, way of having things pass. And it's similar to what happened in Scottish clans, where it's not necessarily the next son, but it's I guess they vote on the next male relative. The next, like amongst the closest male relatives, and that's kind of how he got it.
I'm not 100% certain about that. I don't think any voting needed to take place, because the idea of democracy in that way wouldn't have really been accepted. So I don't think they needed to vote on it, but I think that by marrying Gertrude, Claudius thus becomes the rightful heir, because Gertrude was the next in line for the throne, sort of, right? So if Hamlet had died and Gertrude had not remarried, then Prince Hamlet, would have been next in line to the throne. But Claudius kind of usurps that kind of lineage by marrying Gertrude. Howard Berkowitz.
Hi. This time reading it, I became aware, or I think I became aware that King Hamlet knew that there was an affair between Claudius and Gertrude before he died. And I was looking at the line on Act 1, Scene 5, line 55, where he says, "Oh, Hamlet, what a falling off was there from me, whose love was that of dignity," and so on. So when he says, what a falling off was there, he's aware that there was a distancing between himself and Gertrude before he was killed. I had never saw that. I had never seen that before. And it never occurred to me that he would have known that there was an affair. It sort of changes the relationship between Gertrude and Claudius and all three of them. But it's pretty clear to me that he was aware of an affair between Claudius and Gertrude. That section there suggests that. So when you asked, like, what had we seen this time that we hadn't seen before, this time I became aware that there was a he knew there was an affair going on.
And how does that kind of change the story for you, Howard?
Well, when it raises the question, when and how long did King Hamlet know that? I think it sort of changes Gertrude's guilt in a way. I've always puzzled over how much Gertrude knows about the killing of her husband, or how much she suspects about it. There's no indication in the play that she knows about it, but I've always played with that idea. So it sort of suggests that there's maybe some agreement between her and Claudius that, I mean, it's a sexual thing. There's a lot of, the Ghost talks about lust, licentiousness, and, those kinds of things, incest. So, it makes me wonder whether whether the two of them had plotted together in some way the death of King Hamlet. Changes her nature a bit.
Nice, thank you. Thank you for that point. Edith, I saw your hand. Let's do John and then Martin and then Edith. So John, go ahead.
Hey, my one thing that struck me is actually that very same first question is what gave Claudius legitimacy, but what it came to me in way of, why do they care if Hamlet stays or goes? And it has two reasons in my mind. What came to me is that, one, they thought, him being here makes it seem as though he approves of Claudius, and so that gives him legitimacy. And two, that he didn't go back to college and then go build up an army and come back to defeat Claudius. Am I off on that? Is that two reasons why they wanted to hold Hamlet where he was?
I think those are right on the money. I think that it is important for Claudius to keep Hamlet close to him. because if he can keep Prince Hamlet, near and be able to perhaps brainwash him and maybe get him on his side, become his new father, I think that will help Claudius in the end not have any sort of kind of lashing out over him becoming the king. So I do think it is an intentional tactic by Claudius to keep Hamlet near so that he can, settle him down and be a father to him, and as opposed to him going back to Wittenberg, where he has the opportunity to learn and get smart and get wise, and then think, hey, wait a second, I should be king right now, not Claudius. Yeah.
Keep your enemies closer.
Exactly. Let's see. Martin and then Edith.
Hi. So I've read the play before, but what I've been thinking about on the reread is that, I mean, Claudius is set up to be illegitimate in a lot of ways, both on a personal and like a historical level. But only some of those really matter to Hamlet, and by extension, the people in the audience who are rooting for him, right? So so he's set up to be illegitimate because one of the reasons is because a brother's not supposed to come before a son in succession. Well, it turns out that Denmark didn't have agnatic primogeniture succession until like 1665, so historically that's off. But whether or not Shakespeare knew or cared about that, what's really, really bugging Hamlet is that he's got a stepdad, right? And that would be true whatever the succession law was. Everyone looks at his behavior and thinks he's grieving a little too hard for his dad, and he might be a threat because he considers himself the heir. But then he unloads in the soliloquies, and what's bugging him is not the death, but the new relationship, which he sees as like twisted. So I'm really starting to appreciate the surface level things and the other things a bit more.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Martine. Something that I got interested in a while back was kind of Freud and his analysis of Hamlet and the Oedipal complex that Hamlet might have with his mother. But I think, there's so much grief about the fact that his mother has moved on, in not a large span of time. And I think of anything, yeah, okay, I'm not king or whatever other driving factors there may be. I think there's a huge amount of grief over the fact that his mother has moved on to this new husband. That's a nice point. Thank you. Edith. Edith, did you have your hand up? Oh, okay. Go ahead and type in your question about the staging. How were special effects achieved? That's an interesting question that I don't know that I have an entirely good answer for you. But I know that there were things that could be done in the globe that we kind of have evidence of. For instance, people could be under the stage. So sometimes you can hear Hamlet referring to the ghost, and he's referring that the ghost voice is below them. And they could actually achieve that by putting someone under the stage to speak or to make those sounds. Swear it, right? Things like that. That's one special effect that I know that they used. Other things, you know, it's hard to say because you know, this play was originally performed in the Globe, which has an open air roof to it. So there wasn't a lot of things that could be done with lights or I don't know, fog. You know, there wasn't much that could be done because of that open air, and we're performing this play at noon. However, there is evidence that because of the kind of intellectual components of the play, it was also very popular to perform it in universities. So there's evidence that this play was performed very early on at Wittenberg and at some major universities around Great Britain. So I imagine that because they could have an enclosed space, there might have been the opportunity to do different sorts of things as far as special effects. You know, there's evidence that during the original staging of Antony and Cleopatra, which was originally staged not in the Globe, but in an indoor space, I believe the Rose, they were able to do lighting effects with candles and thus create shadows and different sort of special effects with lighting because of that space. I imagine they might have been able to do things like that if it was in, you know, the Elizabethan version of an auditorium at University of Wittenberg. So that's all I can say about that. Does anyone else have any further insight? Richard Lee, your hand is up.
Yes. You hear
Go
me?
ahead.
So I've read the play a few times, and one thing that's perplexed me is that the three soliloquies that we cover, the first one is a downer, and right, and the second one, he has a plan that plays the thing. He works himself up into a frenzy, then he gets it together. He's going to test a hypothesis that plays the thing. Then the next one, of course, is a famous one, to be or not to be, but he's sort of suicidal there, right? And it always struck me strange because the next scene is instructions to the actors, like, get on with it, speak the speech I pray you. So, and I struck by this because I saw the Christopher Plummer version, which is an old version, and they switched the order. I think there's some others. And in the first folio, the so-called bad folio, they have the order, sad, sad, go for it. So I just wonder if you have any comments about that.
You know, I think it's interesting going back to this idea that Hamlet is wavering between action and inaction. I think it's interesting that the first one is contemplative, and then the next one moves in, and then he comes back to contemplative, and then speak the speech is giving orders, right? That one is moving to action. I think that can be an intentional sort of dramatic through line, looking at how Hamlet is really wrestling with this idea of shouldn't I, to be or not to be, right? To kill or not, to do or not. I've also seen versions of the play where the orders have been switched. The production that they most recently did at the Shakespeare Theater had the orders of the speeches switched. I believe, I can't remember anymore, but I know to be or not to be came rather early. I want to say it was maybe the second speech that they did in the play. And I thought it was interesting, you know, and I think it's kind of up to the artists creating the project to say, is it a stronger story to say, okay, let's look at this character going from action to inaction, to action again, to inaction again, and so on and so forth? Or is it a stronger story to say, let's see all the inactive pieces in the beginning, and then once he gets on the active train, he just goes. I think there's value to both of those formats, both of those orchestrations, but it kind of depends on the artists and how they want to craft that story.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I learned some things this week, just kind of looking at the idea of tragedy and how the Elizabethans and how Shakespeare might have approached tragedy. So I want to talk a little bit about tragedy from an Aristotelian sense, and then tragedy from an Elizabethan sense, and kind of talk about how Shakespeare might have been composing or constructing this specific tragedy of Hamlet. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go through some of the PowerPoint, and then we'll come back and discuss a little bit, and then we'll go through the end of the PowerPoint and come back and discuss a little bit. So to start us off, I'm sharing my screen. Start. 2, 1, 0, and we're shared. Okay. My iPad has not been backed up. Okay, great. So, the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. We're looking at the idea of tragedy specifically, but just to go back even further, storytelling has sort of been a form of playmaking, which started around 2000 BC. The artistry in spoken word was actually a huge component of cultures in the African continent, and there's evidence of, you know, hunters coming back from their trips hunting and putting on these stories, putting on these dramatic reenactments of some of the things that they saw and some of the lessons that they learned. So this idea of playmaking and storytelling has always kind of carried this tradition in humanity of being a way to teach people through our experiences. You know, I go out on my hunt, I have these experiences, I come back, I tell the shaman about it. The shaman puts on a show with a dance and singing, and it can be entertaining, but there's also a message behind it that's hopefully teaching the young hunters that are watching things to be aware of, and how, you know, when they grow up to be hunters, how they can hunt successfully. So, you know, we have evidence of our first kind of facets of theater being around 2000 BC amongst the continent of Africa. Now, moving forward, we see the tradition of theater kind of becoming more moving away from a tradition of spoken word and spoken dramatic culture to sort of being something that people are writing down. And we start getting our first records of printed plays around the festivals of Dionysus in the Greek culture. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Now, what's next? Yes. Now, in our Greek culture, we meet a philosopher named Aristotle. And Aristotle was many things. He studied metaphysics and logic and psychology, ethics, and politics. He also studied astronomy and geology and biology, and also rhetoric, poetry, and theater. And he had a lot of writings. He lived from about 384 BC to about 322 BC. And in his lifetime, he put out a lot of writings of philosophical ideas having to do with these major kind of new subjects that were coming up in humanity. And along with gaining new knowledge in the Greek culture, we were also writing down things for the first time, or at least the writings of those things were lasting. They weren't necessarily just being written on cave walls and then disappearing for thousands of years, but we had ways through papyrus plants and even putting things on stone of kind of recording information so that it could be passed down through the generations. Aristotle recorded a piece of literature called the Poetics. And in the Poetics, he talks about the art of playmaking. And the Poetics specifically is about the genre of tragedy. You know, the Poetics kind of starts off talking about there are many different kinds of dramatic literature that can be written: tragedy, comedy, epic poetry, dithyrambics, which, you know, are kind of our musicals of the Greek sense, and et cetera, et cetera. Most of the writings about some of these other genres have been lost to us, but the writing about tragedy in the Poetics is still around today. And Aristotle kind of sets out all of these ideas about what makes a strong tragedy, what is the purpose of tragedy, and how can a playwright or a theater maker sort of create the strongest version of a tragedy. He sets down some essential qualities that a tragedy must have. He says that a tragedy is an imitation of action. So it's not narrative, you know, it's not people sitting down telling a story, but rather people pretending to act a story. He calls this this method of pretending mimesis, right? Imitation. And this mimesis, this imitation of action, should be serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. And just breaking down those three components: serious because it's not a comedy, and comedy at the time was seen to deal with characters of lower status and of absurd situations. So these characters that could not help themselves would get caught in these ludicrous situations. And, you know, there's some value in that, seeing the Three Stooges try to put together a fence and they end up tacking a nail into their nose. There's some value in that. But Aristotle said that a tragedy is not of that ludicrous sense. It is serious. It's complete. So it has a beginning, a middle, and an end to it. And, you know, Aristotle kind of talks about the unities. There's a unity of time, there's a unity of place. And kind of what that means is that the tragedy takes place in a single time period. So we're really watching the events happening over a few days to a few weeks. But no, not much longer than that. If we're watching a dramatic reenactment that's taking place over years and years, that's more of an epic than it is a tragedy, right? So it's got a unified amount of time. and it takes place in a specific place. So Oedipus Rex takes place in Crete, and we don't really move out of that environment throughout the play. And it's of a certain magnitude, so keeping it succinct and complete makes it so that it's not too long. Once again, he's establishing the difference between tragedy and other forms of dramatic literature like comedy or epics or etc. Great. He also says that the language of tragedy should be embellished and of characters of a high status, right? So I said a little bit earlier that comedy kind of looked at characters of a lower status, whereas tragedies, because, and we'll get to this in a minute, but because of the significance of learning something from a tragedy, it was most easily learned by characters that we could look up to. So instead of seeing people kind of on our status levels, we're looking at princes and kings and queens, royalty and nobility who have the potential of acting well, and for whatever reasons, they don't. So we're looking up to these characters and keeping them in a high status so that we can learn something from them. The language of these characters, thus, are also sort of high in status. There is a language of rhythm, right? Tragic high status characters are usually speaking in a form of verse as opposed to prose. Even if you look at Shakespeare, his tragic works are usually composed in some sort of verse. It's usually iambic pentameter, whereas his comedic characters are usually speaking in prose. We're planning on doing the comedy Much Ado About Nothing this summer at CSC, and that play is basically entirely in prose. So these characters are speaking in a high status to kind of go along with their character. The language can also contain harmony and song, because it was thought that these elements are helping to embellish the language, helping to bring these characters up onto a pedestal to where they can be admired. And then he says that these different kinds of languages can be found in different parts of the play, right? So maybe characters in heightened emotional sensibilities might speak in a different type of verse than characters that are not in a heightened situation. So we can also kind of follow the action of what's happening based on how the characters are speaking. What kind of rhythm are they speaking in? And that might give an indication to what type of emotional state they're in. From the way the characters are speaking, it's a very sort of formulaic way of expression. And I think this formula of how a character acts kind of takes a shape in Aristotle's idea about what tragedy is. Great. And then most importantly, Aristotle brings up the subject of catharsis. And this is the Greek spelling of the word catharsis with a K. You've probably also seen it spelled with a C. Either are acceptable. But he says that above all, these tragic heroes, right, these characters of high status in a tragedy should evoke a catharsis within the audience. And he has identified catharsis as being a purgation of pity and fear, right? Watching these high status, admirable characters do bad things, we pity their downfall, and we thus fear it happening to ourselves, right? It rises about these feelings of pity and fear. From that, Aristotle claims that the purpose of tragedy is a moral and ethical purpose. From watching these admirable characters make mistakes, we pity them, we empathize with their situation, and then we learn, oh, not to do that in our own lives. So tragedy thus kind of becomes a moral, a theater of morality. Great. Aristotle sets up kind of the through line of action in a tragedy. And I just want to talk a little bit about the well-made play. So in France, in the 1800s, Eugene Scribe kind of codified ideas of Aristotle in a piece that's called La Pièce Bien Faite. And I've got that written down on the next slide. But what he does is he takes this idea of form that Aristotle has set down, and he kind of codifies it into a modern idea of how to make a play, how to make a tragic play, at least. Here we kind of have the basic model of what that well-made play structure looks like. You know, before the inciting incident in a play, we get some time period of exposition where we meet the characters, we learn about their backstory, and we kind of learn where we are, what are the given circumstances of the play that we're in. And then at some point, you know, after that expository area, we get an inciting incident. This was a moment in the play that kind of sparks the action of the play. And from then on, the protagonist, right, the single tragic hero set forth in our play begins a journey. And then as we follow that character through our journey, we get a rising action where we follow the chain of events one by one by one by one. And I love that it's kind of set up as a hill, because the character is kind of traveling uphill as he or she or they are going against or going towards this goal. And then eventually they meet a climactic situation. And this climax is kind of what the inciting incident has been building towards, right? This moment happens in the play that starts our protagonist, our tragic hero, on a journey. And then eventually they reach a climax at the top of the hill where the point of their journey reaches a standstill. And at that climax, the protagonist reaches a discovery of some sort, and thus through that discovery, there is a reversal. He learns something about himself, and thus, hopefully, even though not always, undergoes some sort of change. That's where the catharsis kind of, that's where the catharsis sort of begins. Because we see this character make that big discovery, and then we say, oh, wow, I feel for that character. I pity that character. I have a response to this character's discovery. And then we see their reversal as they try to turn and change from their fate. And thus we fear that in our own lives, right? So there's where the learning begins at the climax. And then the action sort of falls into a denouement. And that's why it's French, because Eugene is from France. But the action sort of falls off, and we get a conclusion of the play. So that well-made play structure was set forth in the 1800s to give us a codified sort of model of what Aristotle was setting forth in his Poetics. Now, I like to think of the inciting incident as the moment where a major dramatic question is asked. This is the question that the protagonist asks him or herself, or asks the audience. And this is thus what drives the action of the play. We move up the hill in search of answering that question, right? That is when our goal is set, and the protagonist goes off in search of this answer. And then at the climax, conclusions are made about the major dramatic question. Sometimes the question is answered, sometimes it's not, but there is some sort of major discovery that happens at the climax that brings the major dramatic question to a conclusion. Aristotle called that discovery an anagnosis, and an anagnorisis, and the reversal of peripeteia. And this helps in the purgation of the pity and fear for the audience. That discovery followed by a reversal. Now, I've got a little sheet here about major dramatic questions. And this is pulled from several sources that I've found over the years, but it kind of gives a lot of ideas onto what a major dramatic question is, how to find the major dramatic question. Christopher Lockhart says that the major dramatic question is the linchpin of the dramatic narrative. It's the purpose for which the story is being told, right? So going back to my protagonist, they set up a goal at the inciting incident to answer this question, and thus the rising action is them in pursuit of that goal. Robert McKee says, hunger for the answer to the major dramatic question grips the audience's interest, holding it to the last act's climax, right? And I think that's so important because Robert McKee talks about how this is important for the audience. The audience holds on to the story through anticipation of what that major dramatic question is. Through hunger, we are brought up that hill towards a climax or a discovery. And then there's more information here. I like these examples of a major dramatic question. So we have in Gone with the Wind, will Scarlett win Ashley, right? In Silence of the Lambs, will Clarice catch Buffalo Bill? In Die Hard with a Vengeance, will McClane free the hostages? When those questions are asked, right, that happens at our inciting incident. That is the spark that sends our protagonist or our tragic hero on their journey. We've got some examples from Shakespeare. Romeo and Juliet. Will Romeo and Juliet ever be together? You know, I like to look at the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet as kind of being the inciting incident of that play, because it's when they kind of officially profess their love to each other. And then Juliet says, "Are you going to marry me?" And he says, "Yeah, I'll marry you. Sure, why not?" And then she sends him off, and he says, "I'll be back tomorrow at the hour of 9. Okay. I'll 'tis 100 years till then." And that's the moment when I think we, the audience, say, "Ooh, are they going to make it?" Even though we had that beautiful prologue at the beginning that says they're going to die, but who knows? Maybe they might die when they're 60, and they're going to live a nice, beautiful life together, as two souls in love with each other. And we have other examples of major dramatic questions. Mary Poppins. This is from Saving Mr. Banks. Will Mary Poppins sign over the rights? Will P.L. Travers sign over the rights to the Mary Poppins book? In Wizard of Oz, we ask, will Dorothy ever actually get back to Kansas? I like this point here, where Lockhart says that MDQs, major dramatic questions, tend to be external or physical. They can also be psychological, right? So we can look at, will Dorothy find her place in the world? There's a psychological major dramatic question that might accompany that story, as opposed to just the external MDQ of, will she get back to Kansas? Both are perfectly valid major dramatic questions, but depending on the audience member, one might be a stronger linchpin to bring an audience member up the hill than the other. Yeah? Now, no, didn't mean to hit that one. Zoom. Stop. Now, I kind of want to hear from you all, and I want to talk about, where do we think the inciting incident is in Shakespeare's Hamlet? Is there an inciting incident, right? Is Shakespeare following this structure of the well-made play at all? And if there is, where is it, and what major dramatic question is being asked at that inciting incident? What's the linchpin that is taking us through the story? So I see some hands. Let's start with Emily Hansen. Go ahead.
So I would put the inciting incident at Hamlet meeting the ghost, and then we follow the rising action, and I would almost say the rising action comes actually to the mousetrap, and that's when we start towards the or maybe even as far forward as Polonius's death, and Hamlet being sent to England, and then everything from there is kind of falling off. And the major defining question is, did Claudius kill Hamlet's father? And if so, will Hamlet get revenge?
Great. Thank you, Emily. Edith. Oh, Edith's mic isn't working. Let's see if she's typing something. Chat. Edith thinks the inciting incident happens off stage. When his father dies, this is King Hamlet, when King Hamlet dies and Gertrude marries Claudius. And then what sort of question are we asked at that point? What would you do? How far would you go? Nice. Margaret Mullen says, shouldn't every good play have more major dramatic questions than just one? And we will talk about that in a moment. Aristotle would say no, there should just be one major dramatic question. However, maybe Shakespeare thinks something different. We will come back to that. Thank you. Ron Hennigan has his hand up.
Yeah, I said, I think it's the appearance of the ghost too. Excuse me, not the appearance, it's talking to Hamlet. When we find out that, that when the ghost says Claudius now wears his crown, right at the point that actually Howard was referring to earlier. What is that, Act 1, Scene 3, around line 40?
Great.
I think that's the inciting incident. Thanks.
No, thank you. Howard, what do you think?
I think that, and thanks, Ron. I think that the inciting incident, I agree that it happens off stage. It happens before the play starts. I think all inciting incidents occur before the play takes place, and it sort of moves the play forward. I think the inciting incident is the death of the murder of King Hamlet, sets everything in motion, sets the wedding in motion, sets the Hamlet's return. I mean, and the question is not whether Claudius did it, because we know that he did it. The question is, will Hamlet get revenge, or will Hamlet kill Claudius? And again, we find that out in the last 12 seconds of the play. As soon as that question is answered, the play's over. And I think that that's the way major dramatic questions work. As soon as it's answered, the play is over. There's no point in continuing the play. So the question is, will Hamlet kill Claudius? Once he does that, the major question's answered, and the play ends in 30 seconds, you know, depending on how you manage it after that. That's my sense of it.
Great. Thank you, Howard. Richard Lee.
So I vote for the play when Hamlet isn't sure whether Claudius has killed his father or not. The ghost suggested it. He sets up the test, the experimental test, which is the mousetrap. And I think it's at that point when the king rises, and he and Horatio are in no doubt that Claudius is guilty. He does vacillate, and I agree, it doesn't end till the right at the end. But that's for me the pivotal point, because he's tested his hypothesis, and it sure looks like it's correct. He then vacillates, of course, but that'll be my 5 cents worth.
Great. So we have some people that think it's happening before the play. Some people think the inciting incident is when Hamlet meets the ghost of his father. Great. Let me just see what these readings are. Yes. Okay. Some people might even say, even though this is a little into the play, some people might even say the inciting incident is after he meets the players, because that's when he gets the idea to do the mousetrap plot. There are a couple of readings that I want to read, and we can listen to them and see if it changes our opinions of where the inciting incident is happening or what the major dramatic question might be. So Matthew, are you online?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Matthew is going to read us a speech from Act 1, Scene 5. Let me just turn to it very quickly, 1 second. Great. So this is right after the ghost has talked to Hamlet, and then he says, you know, revenge my foul murder. Then he says, adieu, adieu, remember me. And then Hamlet goes into this speech. So Matthew, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and read it for us.
Oh, all you host of heaven, oh earth, what else? And shall I couple hell? Oh, fie. Hold, hold my heart, and you, my sinews, grow not instant old, but bear me stiffly up. Remember thee. Ay, thou poor ghost, while memory hold a seat in this distracted globe. Remember thee. Yea, from the table of my memory I'll wipe away all trivial, fond records, all saws of books, all forms, all pressures past, thy youth and observation copied there. And thy commandment all alone shall live within the book and volume of my brain, unmixed with the baser matter. Yes, by heaven. Oh, most pernicious woman. Oh, villain, villain, smiling, damned villain. My tables, meet it is, I set it down, that one may smile and be a villain. At least, I am sure, it may be so in Denmark. So, uncle, there you are. Now to my word. It is adieu, adieu. Remember me. I have sworn.
Very nice. Thank you, Matthew. Do we know what my tables is in reference to, everyone? I see some heads shaking no. That's okay. So the phrase "my tables" is in reference to Hamlet probably has a diary or some papers of some sort that he's jotting all this down in. So he says, "My tables, my tables." He pulls out the diary and he starts to write down. There's something interesting here where he doesn't want to forget what's just happened, right? There's this idea where if you have a vivid dream, when you wake up, you got to write it down immediately or else you'll forget it. And I think Shakespeare's playing with that idea a little bit. Hamlet wants to make sure that in a week's time, when he comes back to this, he remembers exactly what happened. So he writes it down, my tables, my tables. Meet it is, I set it down, that one may smile and be a villain, right? So he's setting down what the ghost has just told him. So he's got a hard evidence if he needs to come back to it. So from this speech, has a decision of action been made? Has a question been asked? I see some people shaking their head yes. Some people saying maybe. I do want to point out, he says at the end of this speech, now to my word, it is adieu, adieu, remember me, I have sworn it. So he's making some sort of pledge here. Maybe we don't know exactly what, though. He doesn't get into the milieu and specifics of exactly what he's swearing, other than he's swearing that he's going to remember his father, right? Now, does that mean he's going to remember the image of this great man, or he's going to remember what the ghost told him, or he's going to remember the action of having to revenge his father's death? It's not clear, I don't think, in this passage, but some sort of oath is being made, and he is like a detective writing down information so that maybe he can put some pieces together a little later on. I want to move to the end of this scene. This is after Horatio and Marcellus have shown back up, And they say, Hamlet, you saw the ghost. And he's like, yeah, it spoke to me. And they're like, well, what did it say? And he's like, no, I'm not going to tell you. You might tell somebody. And like, no, we won't tell anybody, right? And we have this little scene of, swear to me that you will keep this secret. And then we hear the ghost underneath us who says, swear it. And Marcellus and Horatio are like, what is it? And then he says, yeah, rest, perturbed spirit. Zoe Landau?
Yes, hello.
Hi. Can you read this last speech of Act 1, Scene 5?
I would love to.
Thank you.
And therefore, as a stranger, give it welcome. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. But come, here as before, never, so help you mercy, how strange or odd some'er I bear myself, as I perchance hereafter shall think meet to put an antic disposition on, that you at such time seeing me never shall with arms encumbered thus, or this head shake, or by pronouncing of some doubtful phrase as, well, we know, or we could, and if we would, or if we list to speak, or there be, and if they might, or such ambiguous giving out to note that you know aught of me. This do swear, so grace and mercy at your most need help you.
And then the ghost says, swear. And can you keep going?
Rest, perturbed spirit. So, gentlemen, with all my love, I do commend me to you. And what so poor a man as Hamlet is may do to express his love and friending to you, God willing, shall not lack. Let us go in together, and still your fingers on your lips, I pray. The time is out of joint. O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. Nay, come, let's go together.
Nice. Is any sort of decision being made here? Is the protagonist asking a question that's going to drive him through the action of the play? What do we think? Laura, go ahead. Laura, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. It seems to me the big thing is he's deciding to do it on his own. He doesn't want help. He doesn't want anybody else there. So it's going to be all him, and everything that goes forward from there, you know, he's going to be taking the responsibility on himself. He's going to be performing it himself, both the performance of, you know, pretending to be insane and then actually going insane, if you believe that he does. But also, you know, the action of actually taking revenge, of being the one to kill Claudius at the time, when that time comes.
Nice. Yeah. I think we, the audience, discover in this moment that he's going to put an antic disposition on, right? There's a very important plot point, because Hamlet decides here in this speech that he's going to pretend to act crazy so that he can learn the truth of it, right? So, you know, I'm not sure what he was swearing to in the last speech, but in this speech, I am sure that he's going to investigate a little bit more. Yeah, so the major dramatic question might be, will he discover the truth of it? Is the ghost telling the truth? Does he need to revenge his father's death? Or the Elizabethans, they might look at this and say, is that a demon spirit trying to damn his soul by unjustly killing his uncle? Or is that a true ghost from purgatory? What is that spirit? Is it a liar? Is it a truthton, as my mother would say? Nick, oh, I'm sorry, Howard, and then Nick.
I like your point very much. That is, I was going to say that he doesn't promise revenge at this last piece at the end of the act. He doesn't say, I'm going to revenge, however strange I bear myself, as I perchance hereafter I shall think meet to kill the king. He says, I think what I'm going to do is put an antic disposition on. So again, there's a kind of a holding pattern that he manages there, which I don't know quite what to make of that, but you're right. He insists that he's going to put an antic disposition on. You know, the ghost tells him, revenge my murder. And he says, okay, I'll put an antic disposition on, instead of saying, okay, I'll kill the king. So there's an interesting piece there. So he does not make the decision that the ghost wants him to make. He does not obey his father here. The ghost says nothing about antic disposition. The ghost says, kill the king. So, you know, does he obey his father? I'm not sure he does here.
Nice. Thank you, Howard. Nick and then Richard.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's Cynthia, since we're sharing the same email.
I'm just telling you what to say. Go ahead, Nick. Your turn to talk.
Go ahead.
Well, anyway, I don't think he has a decision to make. I think the decision is already made and he has to go through with it. At the very last line of that act and scene where he says, "Oh, cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right." I think he's committed by the nature of who he is, and he doesn't have a choice. He has to do this, and that antic disposition is the method that he might do, but he's been cursed. He can't say no. He is the son of the king, and he's got to set it right.
Thank you. Yeah, and something that's very interesting about rhyming couplets. Paul Mason Barnes, who's a mentor of mine, and worked for several years at Utah Shakes and Oregon Shakes and etc. He talks about a rhyming couplet at the end of a scene is the character making some sort of pledge. The sort of heightenedness of the language gets so heightened that out of nowhere they begin to speak in rhyming verse instead of blank verse, and that heightenedness comes out of a necessity to have to do something, right? So I do think we can look at "Oh, cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right" as Hamlet making some sort of pledge here at the end of the scene. We've got Richard and then Teresa.
So my take on the antic disposition is that he's just stumbled on a big finding. The ghost told him who'd murdered his father, but he knows he's dealing with villains, so he better put up a smoke screen. He doesn't want them to know what he knows, and that's what I always assumed. It was just a strategy that he employed so that he could move forward. That's just a suggestion.
No, definitely. I think so. And I think someone in the chat asked, how does acting crazy help? And I think that's right on the money of how, you know, this is a strategy to discover the truth. I'm going to play dumb or play a little crazy and see what sort of rooms I can maybe sneak my way into and nobody's going to notice, so that I can overhear what the truth might be. I think it's a very intelligent plan in some respects. Teresa, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my thought was kind of bringing together what Howard and Cynthia had been saying, which is I agree with Cynthia a lot that he's like committing himself to an action, but you could also read that as like he doesn't want to deal with the choice he has to figure out. Like if this ghost is a evil demon, then he needs to figure that out, and that doesn't work out well for him. And if the ghost is correct, then he needs to kill his uncle, and that doesn't work out well for him either. So I don't think he necessarily needs to be committed on a certain course, but he's like sort of committed at the fork in the road, and either fork is bad.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Martine, go ahead.
I just, talking about this makes me think that not very many of the adaptations I've seen of Hamlet have really gotten across the idea that if Hamlet gets any of this wrong, he's probably going to be executed. You know, I mean, this is killing a king isn't easy. Killing family isn't easy. And if he gets found out or acts too quickly or too rashly, then, I mean, if the tragedy is not just about pitying the hero, but about fearing for them, we should be fearing for Hamlet's life as he's doing this. But I also think we have to be willing to say that he's full of crap sometimes, because he really resents the fact that he has to do this, and I don't know that he needs much more evidence as he's already got, especially because he already thinks his uncle is crossed a line here. So I think he's committed, but he might be trying to leave a way out of it, I think.
Yeah, and the idea of duty can always be overwhelming, and I think it's very human to say, I know that I have this responsibility, so I'm going to find every reason I can to not do it, because, well, it's hard, and it would require maturity and sort of a steadfastness in decision making that I may not be ready to make at this moment. It's interesting, and I'm getting a little ahead of the play, but spoiler alert, later on in the play, once Hamlet does figure out that Claudius killed his father, he has a scene where he walks past Claudius and Claudius is praying, and he says, well, no, I can't kill him now, because if I kill him in the middle of prayer, his soul is going to go to heaven and not to hell where it belongs. I think there is a legitimate concern of heaven and hell and salvation for Hamlet. And, it wouldn't have been unheard of for an Elizabethan character to be wrestling with the trials of one's soul. And then he goes into his mother's room, and he hears Polonius behind the curtain or behind the arras, and he says, oh, is that the king? Go! And he stabs him immediately. Doesn't even think about it. Doesn't even say, oh, who is that? Is it right? He just stabs. So once he gets that proof that he needs, then he's just on a rampage, and he's just stabbing everybody. So, I do think there's a legitimate concern for soul and concern about heaven and hell in pursuing this ghost's wishes that Hamlet is dealing with. Okay, I want to move forward to this other area. This is Act 3, Scene 1, and it's the oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I speech. I've split the speech into two pieces just to give two people a chance to read, and also it's a hefty speech, but I do want to hear all of it and ask ourselves, is there something tangible and important that the character is discovering and latching onto that may be driving them through the play? So John Wright, I have you reading the first half, and then Kevin Maroney, I have you reading the second half. So whenever you're ready.
Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul to his own conceit, that from her working all his visage wan, tears in his eye, distraction in aspect, a broken voice, and in his whole functioning suiting with forms to his conceit, and all for nothing. For Hecuba, what's Hecuba to him? Or he to Hecuba, that he should weep for her? What should he do had he the motive and the cue for passion that I have? He would drown the stage with tears and cleave the general ear with horrid speech, make mad guilty and appall the free, confound the ignorant and amaze indeed the very faculties of eyes and ears. Yes, I, a dull and muddy meddled rascal, peak like John a dreams, unpregnant in my cause, and can say nothing. No, not for a king upon whose property and most dear life a drama, a damned defeat was made. Am I a coward? Who calls me a villain, breaks my pate across, plucks off my beard and blows it into my face, tweaks me by the nose, gives me the lie in the throat as deep as to the lungs? Who does this? Swans, I should take it, for I cannot be, but I am pigeon-livered and lack gall to make oppression bitter. For ere this, I should have fattened all the region kites with their slaves awful. Bloody, bloody villain, remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain. Oh, vengeance.
Bravo.
Why, what an ass am I? This is most brave that I, the son of a dear father murdered, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, must, like a whore, unpack my heart with words and fall a cursing like a very drab, a stallion, fie upon it, foe, about my brains. I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have, by the very cunning of the scene, been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. For murder, though it have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organ. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before mine uncle. I'll observe his looks, I'll tend him to the quick. If he do blench, I know my course. The spirit that I have seen may be a devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape, yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. I'll have grounds more relative than his. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king.
Very nice, thank you. So what sort of discoveries is the character making here? What major questions are being asked now? Yes, Richard, go ahead.
So, as I understand it, in the first part of the speech, he works himself into a frenzy because he's saying, "Why aren't I as emotionally involved as the player, who is just it's just fiction?" But then he after he gets himself up to the point where he says vengeance, then he calms down about my brains, and then he in the best scientific tradition, he formulates a hypothesis. Well, he's got his hypothesis, but he's going to experimentally test it, and he's going to play the play before for the mousetrap before his uncle, and so he has a plan.
Yeah, great. And so, you know, we as the audience might ask, oh, okay, well, great. Is he going to get the proof that he needs from setting up this play where guilty creatures sitting at a play, you know, will reveal all of their guilt? It's interesting because going back to a comment that was made a little earlier, I don't know that there is a single inciting incident in this tragedy. I don't know that there is a single major dramatic question that gets asked. I think that we ask one question and we kind of get an answer to it, and then we ask another question and we kind of get an answer to that, and we move on to something else. There are a lot of questions being asked. There are a lot of incidents inciting the character to action, right? He may be incited to go over here off of one incident, and then incited to go over there off of another incident. Howard, go ahead.
In hearing this speech just read this time again, I realized I had always thought that Hamlet made the decision to put the play on at that point. You know, that, oh, about my brain, let me figure this out, voila. But 100 lines earlier, he says, "Dost thou hear me, old friend? Can't thou play the murder of Gonzago? And would you study a speech of some 12 or 16 lines, which I would set down?" So Hamlet already there knows that he's going to put the play within the play on, and he knows which play it is, and he knows the lines. He's ready to think about the playwright in him, wants to put these lines down. So really, it's kind of interesting that almost as soon as he hears that the players are coming to town, he figures out that this is what he's going to do. I had always thought that he doesn't make that decision until the end of the scene, you know, the end of the act, but it's not true. He makes it at line 550, or earlier than that. He makes it on line, 560. Murder of Gonzago. I'll write the lines that you're going to speak the speech, so you're going to, you know, trap the king. So that's the first time I had realized that Hamlet does not make the decision there. He's made it a long time ago or a while ago that he's going to do that as soon as he hears the players come.
Yeah. But, you know, still in Act 3, Scene 1, as opposed to having come up with that plan, you know, when he was on the battlements with Marcellus and Horatio, he doesn't make the play until now, 3 acts in. So, you know, it's interesting that we would have an inciting incident now at this point where I think we are halfway through. This is Act 3, Scene 1 that we're in right now. So, you know, I think there are several places of incidents inciting this tragic hero to action, which is a little different than the structure that's been set down by Aristotle and subsequently codified by our Frenchmen. I'm going to go, no, I'm going to go back to the slideshow. Start. And we're in. Okay. Great. So this was just a slide talking about some other analyses of tragedy. If you ever have the time or are ever interested, we're not going to spend too much time on this slide because we are nearing 7:30 now. But if you ever have some time, there's some also very interesting stuff about what is tragedy, and looking at sort of Aristotle's edicts and how they may take form in contemporary society. Playmaking, a manual of craftsmanship, is a piece written by Britishman William Archer. So while the French were writing their thesis on the well-made play, William Archer was writing this. And then George Pierce Baker, an American, was writing the dramatic technique. Friedrich Nietzsche writes a body of work called The Birth of Tragedy, which is quite interesting. And then there's a book called The Denial of Death, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning nonfiction piece from the 1970s. And Ernest Becker talks about kind of the existential dilemma that all humans have and how we're sort of running from our death, and that gives rise to elements of both comedy and tragedy. So if you have any time, you know, during this quarantine and want something to read, there's some interesting pieces. But the interpretation of tragedy that I want to look at is from Boethius. Boethius would have been one of the last sort of classical philosophers. So, you know, we have Aristotle and Plato and Homer, and then, you know, when we get to the end of this classical period, we start to move into the medieval period of history. We get Boethius, who was a Roman statesman who did something that we're not entirely sure of, but he did something and got locked up and sentenced to death. And while he was locked up, he wrote this body of work called The Consolation of Philosophy, which is ideally what it sounds like. He was consoling himself in jail, knowing that he was going to be put to death soon enough. He was consoling himself with philosophy, and thus using a lot of the philosophical teachings to help console other people that might have been in unfortunate situations. He brings about this character of Fortuna. And Fortuna, I guess we can see as a god of sorts, who at her will controls our fate. And I've got some stuff in here. So The Consolation of Philosophy was translated by Elizabeth I, but it was also translated by Henry Chaucer, which is where I get this quote from. This is Chaucer's quote, where he says, "What else does the cry of tragedy bewail, but of the overthrow of happy realms by the unexpected blow of fortune?" Now, this idea of tragedy and fortune would have been very prevalent to Elizabethans and to Shakespeare, because Boethius's work would have probably been more relatable than some of Aristotle's work. Boethius kind of unintentionally wrote something that was very Christian, whereas the Greeks of Aristotle's time, I mean, Christianity wasn't necessarily a thing because that was before Christ. But the Greeks didn't deal with this idea of fortune in the same way, and Elizabethans are noted to have found more relatability and consolation, in fact, from Boethius's work than from Aristotle's work. This idea of, I'm sorry? This idea of happiness, Boethius says, comes from within. And fortune, or fortuna, is kind of seen as this fickle spirit. She's often characterized as having a wheel, you know, like the wheel of fortune, the game show gets its name from this idea presented to us by Boethius. She's presented as having this wheel, and when she feels like it, she'll just spin it. And people that may have had good fortune today will have bad fortune tomorrow. She's characterized often by not just Shakespeare, but by a lot of Elizabethan writers as a strumpet and as fickle. And, you know, those words kind of being synonyms in this time period, but as someone that kind of just does her will, you know, and it doesn't matter. But here's the kind of Christian aspect that we take away from Boethius, is that Boethius says, let not your spirit eat itself away. We are all living in a common sphere and can find gratefulness in the life we are undeservedly given. The consolation of philosophy is kind of set up as the writer is talking to Madam Philosophy or Lady Philosophy, something like that. But he's having a conversation with this personification of philosophy. And Lady Philosophy is consoling him by saying, hey, these things that you have do not belong to you. You came into this world naked, and you didn't have any money. You had no clothes, you had no friends, you had nothing. All you had was life. So whether fortune gives you wealth or whether she makes you poor, whether fortune gives you love or whether you live a life without love, whether fortune gives you, I don't know, friends, or you live a friendless life, it doesn't matter, because it's hers to give and it's hers to take away. What matters is that you have life to begin with. So there's consolation in knowing, hey, I woke up this morning, my lungs are working, I'm breathing, my heart is beating, my mind is in its right state of mind, and that enough is enough to be grateful for. Because all of these other things, these worldly things that fortune gives or takes away, don't actually belong to us. So we have no right to be bitter if we don't get them, right? We have no ownership of them because they're not ours, they're of the world. And that ideal was a very Christian sort of sensibility. That the Elizabethans, you know, would have known and would have appreciated. Now, this idea of fortune, here we are. Wait, let me go on to the next slide. Oh, wait. No, I didn't want to go there yet. Okay, that's fine. But this idea of fortune by the English poet Sir Philip Sidney, he says that tragedy teacheth the uncertainty of this world, and upon how weak foundations gilden roofs are builded. We probably would say built, but I think the Elizabethans liked builded. And I found this Maybelline ad because I think it kind of really embodies what Boethius says, right? Maybe she's born with it, maybe it's Maybelline. You know, the Elizabethans might have said, maybe it's hamartia, maybe it's fortuna. Now, hamartia was set about by Aristotle as sort of characterizing the tragic flaw. So going back to our tragic hero, which has, who has some sort of fault in them, and because of that fault, they begin to make mistakes. Then from watching their mistakes, we learn to pity them and to fear making those mistakes in ourself. That flaw is known as hamartia, based off of Aristotle. And there is a passage that I would like Laura Silvius to read. This is from Act 1, Scene 4. And I'm going to bring back up the regular screen.
When do you want me to start?
Now.
I merry ist, but to my mind, though I am native here and to the manner born, it is a custom more honored in the breach than the observance. This heavy-headed revel east and west makes us traduced and taxed of other nations. They cleap us drunkards and with swinish phrase soil our addition. Indeed, it takes from our achievements, though performed at height, the pith and marrow of our attribute. So oft it chances in particular men, that for some vicious mole of nature in them, as in their birth, wherein they are not guilty, since nature cannot choose his origin, by the o'ergrowth of some complexion oft breaking down the pales and forts of reason, or by some habit that too much o'erleavens the form of plosive manners, that these men, carrying, I say, the stamp of one defect, being nature's livery or fortune's star, his virtues else be the as pure as grace, as infinite as man may undergo, shall in the general censure take corruption from that particular fault. The dram of evil doth all the noble substance of a doubt to his own scandal.
Thank you. So this scene is taken, Hamlet, Horatio, and Marcellus are on the battlements waiting for the ghost the first time, because Horatio said, hey, we think we saw your father's ghost. And Hamlet's like, oh, take me, take me. And they're sitting out there waiting for the ghost, and Hamlet's waiting to see the spirit for the first time. And they hear cannons going off in the distance. And Horatio, who's kind of, new to this land, or at least he's new to King Claudius's rule of the land, he asks, what are the cannons about? And Hamlet says, oh, every time the king drinks, they set off the cannons as some sort of wild celebration. And then he begins to talk about the king's drunkenness and sort of the faults, this mole of nature, as he calls it, in the king. And then he says, but, who are we to judge? Because it's a mole, right? We're born with it, or it kind of sprouts out of nowhere. We don't really have any control over it. Nature gave it to us, and alas, that is our fault. Shakespeare is describing the nature of hamartia through Hamlet, which is interesting because I think throughout the play, this play is about many things, but I think one major thing that it's looking at is it's looking at the nature of tragedy. And in a lot of respects, it's defining and redefining the idea of what makes something tragic. When we look at Hamlet as a tragic hero, his mole of nature isn't as simple as we may have found in some of our other tragic heroes of the past. I have a colleague who works out in the Midwest, and he likes to talk about the hamartia as being one of the 7 deadly sins. So he's like, a tragic hero is either suffering from pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, or sloth, or sometimes a mixture of several of them. And from watching their faults through this hamartia, we learn to be a little less prideful. We learn to be a little less gluttonous, or be a little less greedy. right? And so tragedy is kind of fulfilling that moral obligation of purging a catharsis out of us through teaching us about the 7 deadly sins. I don't know that Hamlet's hamartia is as simple. You know, this idea of Claudius having a mole of nature of drunkenness or even just frivolity, right? We might see that as, well, it's a little greedy and it's a little lustful and it's a little gluttonous, right? I think we can like clearly see Claudius's fault, although Claudius is not the tragic hero of this play. Shakespeare is kind of redefining what hamartia is. Looking at some other elements of tragedy, he's not necessarily following the shape set down for us through Aristotle and the well-made play. You know, the inciting incident is a little unclear. The major dramatic question, you know, I think are bountiful. I think there are several major dramatic questions that are grabbing us as an audience and pulling us up that hill of rising action. Then if we want to look at the Elizabethan idea of fortune, right, oh, I had a note. Fortune is too big of an element to describe in this play. If tragic events are just by happenstance of fortune, then what is the lesson? And I think Hamlet, kind of being the speaker of Shakespeare, talks about fortune. You know, we hear about fortune a few times. The Player King talks about fortune when he does his speech of Pyrrhus. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Hamlet talk about fortune when they meet in that first scene, and he says, "Oh, are you at the top of fortune, or are you at the bottom of her?" And they say, "Oh, we're kind of in the middle in her private suite, right?" So it's a nice little sexual joke. But they're having a philosophical debate about the fickleness of fortune and what's the point of it, right? You're not at the top, you're not at the bottom, you're in the middle. Who cares? And then Hamlet talks about fortune a little bit later as well. After he kills Polonius, he has some lines about fortune. Hamlet is kind of serving as the voice of Shakespeare, debating this idea of fortune and saying, well, what's so tragic about it if we can't actually control the idea of fortune? It's just random and by happenstance. So thus there's no element of learning in it, right? You can't necessarily learn by something that you can't predict. So Shakespeare, in a sense, is, through this play, constructing his own idea of what tragedy is. He's writing a new tragedy and constructing ideas that conflict with each other that might make an audience question, what is actually tragic? What is the tragic fault, right? Is that actually something necessary? Because I'm not sure that our tragic hero of Hamlet has one, right? What is the actual structure? Is there a major dramatic question? Is there an inciting incident? Because I'm not sure concretely where one may be. This kind of, you know, goes off track a little bit from some of Shakespeare's other tragedies. I think if we look at Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, we have very clear tragic heroes. You know, we talked about Romeo and Juliet a little bit earlier. I think the balcony scene is the inciting incident. I'm not sure of any other place in that play where some sort of major question is being asked that's pulling us through the play. And I think a lot of Shakespeare's tragedies, at least up until Hamlet, are following kind of this Aristotelian and also a Boethian method of, or rather construction of tragedy. And Hamlet is an interesting play, going back to what we talked about last week, about how it's so universal, how it's lasted all of these years, because it is looking at the old and the new. He's bringing up old ideas of what tragedy is, what tragedy should be, and he's challenging them, and in doing so, constructing his own sort of version of tragedy. There's one little picture I'm going to draw, and then I'm going to stop talking. Where is it? It's fun. No, I don't want that. Hold on. Oh, that's what I wanted. So I think if we look at kind of the action of this play, it moves like this. So the rising action isn't so defined. Looks like a ghost. Thank you. The rising action isn't so defined. The inciting incident isn't so defined, because there are several moments where we can see some sort of incident is happening that is bringing us to a new sort of rising moment. We can see maybe several moments of climax in the play. It's not holding on to Aristotle's ideals that there needs to be, you know, a unity of time and a unity of place and one protagonist and an inciting incident that leads to a rising action and a climax and a denouement. It's questioning the idea of fortune, and it's kind of writing its own sort of version of tragedy. Any thoughts, any comments, questions, concerns? Yes, Emily.
Sorry for that. So I think that kind of brings some really interesting idea to my mind, that you can kind of, outside of Hamlet, you can kind of put Shakespeare's tragedies into one or two buckets. They're either a tragedy that's the result of fate, or a tragedy that's the result of a tragic flaw in the hero. Romeo and Juliet, you can pretty well put into the bucket of fate, you know, oh, I am fortune's fool. Whereas, you know, maybe Lear, you can put Lear into the bucket of tragic, you know, a tragic flaw in the hero. You know, Lear's refusal to, you know, admit that he's wrong, to trying to divvy up his land. Othello, you could put in the tragic flaw category. But Hamlet, you can't really say tragic flaw or fate.
No, yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think it's also worth stating that Shakespeare was experimenting in his writing throughout his career, you know, so I don't think any of his tragedies follow exactly to the T the guidelines that you know, Aristotle might have set for what good tragedy should be. I think he was experimenting throughout, and in comedy as well, and in the English histories. But I think this is Shakespeare's biggest experiment as far as the sort of construction of what a tragedy is, because it does, like you said, deviate quite a lot from either of these buckets of thinking, either the Aristotelian or the Boethian versions of tragedy. John Wright, and then Walt.
Yeah, hey. Talking about the changing of the Aristotelian idea of theater that Shakespeare did brings to my mind the prologue from Henry V, where, you know, he apologizes and says, I'm doing it not exactly this way. One little horse is 10,000. But I also, back to tragedy and comedy, particularly in Shakespeare, my daughter's high school English teacher, Shakespeare teacher, said to her something that I was like, oh, that's genius. She said, pretty much all the comedies and all the tragedies are the same until you get to the last scene. And there's either a wedding and a feast, or there's a bunch of dead bodies in the field, you know? And I guess that's my point. This is, if there was a wedding at the end with Ophelia, it would be a comedy. One of the best Hamlets I saw was down in DC in '93 when the actor from Amadeus played Hamlet, the guy that won the Academy. It was hysterical. It was hysterical up to that last play. They played it as a comedy. And I just thought those two things, particularly in Shakespeare, mix a lot.
You know, I like that, and I've heard that before. And someone once said to me, well, at the end of Hamlet, and I don't know, maybe this is stretching, you can tell me what you think, but they say, well, at the end of Hamlet, there is a marriage because Fortinbras comes in, and this foreign power marries himself to Denmark now. And he sort of pledges an allegiance now to taking over Denmark, and he says, let the drums strike. I think there are also other examples of plays, like if you look at Troilus and Cressida, there is neither a marriage.
Not a lot.
But some people characterize that play as a comedy, and some people call it a tragedy. And I think, you know, going back to this idea of Shakespeare just wrote what he wanted. He wrote outside the box, and sometimes it didn't really fit into how other people were writing, or sometimes it's just a little bit ambiguous, right? Looking at Romeo and Juliet, is there a tragic hero in that play? Or are there two tragic heroes? If there are two, then that's a little wild, because Aristotle would have like scoffed at that. Two tragic heroes? Well, how are we supposed to learn anything if we don't have one person to follow? So, you know, I do think there's a lot of experimentation going on. Walt, and then Martine.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. One of the things I like so much about reading Shakespeare and watching his plays is how he portrays the psychology of human beings, of all of us. In that fourth scene of Act 1, Horatio's asking him, what are the sound of the cannons? And it launches Hamlet into a discussion of tragic flaws and faults. And that actually puts us in a position of thinking about Claudius as not the best of people. Immediately after that, the ghost appears to confirm that view of things. We get a sense of Shakespeare's state of mind about his uncle and some of his problems with him from the start. By the way, one question that was asked right at the start, why wasn't Hamlet the heir apparent? I was looking at Google on this and a couple of other sources. It turns out that in medieval Denmark, there was a parliament called the Thing, which elected the king. And in Act 5, Hamlet talks about how his uncle stole the election and whored his mother. Again, we see a lot of Hamlet's motivations, but it's tucked in late in the play in a way that's almost missed. It's something about the layering of this. It's so human, and the complexity makes the characters memorable and the plays watchable again and again. Just my thoughts.
Thank you. Awesome. Martine.
I gotta say, I couldn't agree more about the line between comedy and tragedy being blurred, especially because when Laertes finds out his sister is drowned, he says, "Too much of water hast thou, poor Ophelia, and therefore I forbid my tears." Like, classy, and that's really classy. But I don't know. I think if we talked for long enough, we could boil down Hamlet to one tragic flaw. I mean, he seems to think he's a coward. We could say he's indecisive. Maybe it's that he's in denial. But what I can't figure out is where the cathartic moment is in the play. I mean, there's some moments that half fit the bill, but just not sure about that.
So I would say let's finish the play and go back to the idea of the major dramatic questions, or question, whichever you attach yourself to. And is there a moment where that question gets tackled head on, right? Is that question ever answered, or is there a major discovery that happens that brings light to the question? Because I would say that would be the climax of the play, and thus the major cathartic moment, right? This is the moment where our tragic hero is making a discovery or a anagnoris, and then going through a reversal, a peripetia. And from watching them make a discovery and reversal, we ourselves can also experience pity and fear for this character. So as we read through the second half of the play, ask yourself, what are some of the major dramatic questions that you found, and where are they being answered, or where are they being met head on? We are at time. It is 8 o'clock. Thank you, everyone, for joining me once again. And go ahead and read the end of the play. We'll be back next week with Vince Eisenson, and we'll pick up from where we left off. Have a good week.
Thank you, Gerald. And your Richard III was excellent.
Oh, thank you.
And your puppy's adorable.
Thank you. Have a good one.